Listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
On March 25th, 2009, Sergeant Jimmy Edmunds responded to a robbery call at a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Georgia. Now, Edmunds thought he was just going to investigate a routine break-in, but once he stepped foot inside of that house, he discovered the most violent crime scene he'd ever witnessed in his entire law enforcement career. For the next 3 days, Edmunds would barely sleep, but he would eventually uncover the truth about what happened in that house of horrors. And let's just say the truth was not what anybody expected. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, this summer, right before it gets really hot, be sure you remove all of the Freon from the follow button's car. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of March 25th, 2009, 41-year-old Kay Parsons woke up in her bedroom in the quiet suburb of Grovetown, Georgia. It was still dark outside, but Kay knew she had a busy morning ahead of her. So she got right out of bed and walked down the hallway to wake up her son. When she went into his room, her son, who was 12 years old, immediately began complaining that he didn't want to wake up yet, but Kay just flipped on his lights and said, "Come on, you gotta get ready for school." Once Kay saw her son actually climb out of bed and begin to get dressed, she rushed downstairs and poured him a bowl of cereal and left it on the table, and then called up to him and said, "Come on, come down, eat your breakfast." And then Kay rushed right back upstairs into her bedroom to get dressed. Now, normally, Kay had help with the morning routine from her husband, David. But David was in Los Angeles on business. David was a career military man who had become a successful civilian contractor after retirement, which meant David worked for the military, but he was not actually a member of the military. And generally speaking, civilian contractors with the military make a lot of money. David's work at a nearby army base is what had brought the family to Georgia 4 years earlier, and his job had allowed them to buy their beautiful 2-story, 4-bedroom home. But the trade-off with David's financial success was that he often had to travel for work, leaving Kay to manage on her own. Most of the time, Kay was perfectly happy to take on everything at home by herself because she knew David was doing his part for the family in other ways. Kay and David had been together since they were in high school, and people who knew them said they had the kind of partnership that made other couples jealous. They seemed to function as this perfect unit, and they always knew how to help the other. But the truth was, behind the scenes, Kay and David were not perfect, and lately they had been going through a really rough patch. They'd been getting in these horrible fights, and then after the fights would end, they would just ignore each other for long periods of time. And so as Kay rushed around her bedroom getting dressed for the day, she couldn't help but feel kind of resentful towards David for not being here that morning to help her. But Kay quickly told herself she was being foolish. Even though they were fighting, she knew the reason David was gone was for work. He was there to help the family, and so she couldn't really be resentful about it. Once Kay was finished getting dressed, she ran to her son's bedroom and grabbed his backpack, and then went back downstairs to the kitchen. When she got there, her son said he was done eating, so Kay handed him his backpack, then she grabbed his empty cereal bowl and put it in the sink, and then she picked up her white leather handbag off the counter and took out her car keys. Then Kay stopped herself because she knew she was running around like a maniac, and she took a breath and then looked over at her son and smiled. Even when she and David were not getting along, they still made sure their son always felt like their house was filled with love and happiness. Kay's son smiled back at her, and then the two of them walked to the garage and got into Kay's car. Kay pulled out of the garage onto Hot Springs Drive, her quiet neighborhood street. And as she did, she looked over at the house next door. Another beautiful brick home, strikingly similar to her own. And in many ways, Kay and her family's lives in Grovetown were directly connected with that house next door. On the day that Kay, David, and their son had moved in, their next-door neighbors, Becky and Tony Sears, and their 5 kids, had dropped by with food to welcome them to their new home. From then on, the two households became inseparable. The adults played tennis together, one of the Sears boys was on the same baseball team as Kay's son, and the two families had vacationed together. Becky even got Kay a job at Healing Hands, the physical therapy clinic where she worked. And not long after Kay and Becky had begun working together, they joined Weight Watchers together. And Kay gave Becky a lot of credit for helping her meet her weight loss goals. Every day, Becky wanted to compare weights and discuss who had lost the most. It made Kay anxious, but she had to admit, peer pressure worked. But in recent weeks, Kay had been so caught up in the problems she was having with her husband that she really hadn't even spoken to Becky. And as Kay drove past Becky's house that morning, she wished she could go back in time to when everything had seemed so perfect. After Kay dropped her son off at school, she went to a McDonald's drive-thru. Even though Kay was a part of Weight Watchers and was trying to lose weight, when she was really stressed out or rushed, she often treated herself to fast food. Kay quickly ate her McDonald's breakfast in the car as she drove back home. She was in a hurry because her handyman, Mitch Cozart, would be arriving at her house soon. Mitch was coming by to repair the back door. But as Kay drove, she was thinking about other projects she might ask him to take care of while he was already at the house. And Kay was still lost in her own thoughts about what she was going to ask him to do when she pulled back into her two-car garage at around 7:15 a.m. Kay got out of her car and walked into the house carrying a half-finished cup of McDonald's coffee and an empty fast food bag. And within seconds of stepping foot inside of her house, Kay heard a loud crashing sound in the kitchen. It sounded like something breaking. Kay had no idea how anything could be falling in her kitchen, and so she quickly rushed around the corner to see what was going on. But what she saw in the kitchen was the last thing she expected. At 8:30 a.m., Kay's handyman, Mitch, walked onto Kay's front porch and rang the doorbell. He knew Kay was expecting him, so he was surprised when no one answered the door. After a few moments, Mitch pulled out his flip phone and called Kay, but Kay didn't pick up. Mitch peeked in the windows of the home, but he couldn't see anyone inside the house, so he walked around to the back. He was there to fix the elegant French doors that were in the back of the house, and so he figured he could at least take a look at the job while he was waiting for Kay. But when Mitch came around the corner of the house and actually saw these French doors, he froze, because one of the panes of glass in the French doors was completely shattered and the French door was open. He called out for Kay from the outside, but no one answered. Mitch had seen enough cop shows to know that he did not want to go inside this house himself and potentially leave fingerprints or footprints, and so instead, Mitch grabbed his phone again and he called 911 to report what appeared to be a break-in. But as Mitch was talking to the 911 operator, he noticed this young man with black hair sitting on the other side of the road on this rock, just staring at Mitch. And then as soon as Mitch got off the phone, the young man with black hair called out to him. Mitch walked across the street towards him, and as he did, he could see the young man looked pretty shaken up. When Mitch finally reached the young man, he told Mitch his name was Michael Bowers, and he lived next door to Kay, and he was actually Kay's friend Becky's oldest son, who was from a previous marriage. Mitch asked Michael if he was okay, but Michael said no. He said he'd overheard Mitch's phone calls to 911, so he knew that Kay's house had been broken into, and he told Mitch that his own house had been broken into as well. He said the house was ransacked with drawers emptied onto the floor and the whole place was a mess. Michael said he had just called his mother at work to let her know. At this point, Mitch was very worried, and he told Michael to stay right where he was and to not go back inside of his house because whoever had broken in might still be there. Then Mitch went back across the street to his truck, and he pulled out the gun he kept in the glove compartment just in case. Then he went back across the street and waited with Michael for the police to arrive. A few minutes later, Sergeant Jimmy Edmunds of the Columbia County Sheriff's Office arrived at Kay's house. His office had received 2 calls within minutes of each other to report break-ins in neighboring houses on Hot Springs Drive. Edmunds thought just 1 break-in would be very unusual for such a quiet, low-crime neighborhood, but 2 break-ins? Something strange was going on. Sheriff's deputies arrived on the scene soon after, and at that point, Edmunds walked around the house with them to the back door with the shattered glass. But before Edmunds even went inside the house, he saw an ominous sign. He could clearly see blood on the kitchen floor. Edmunds turned back around and looked at the deputies and made sure they saw the blood too, and they nodded, and then Edmunds led them into the house. And immediately Edmunds saw the blood trail went all the way out of the kitchen and down the front hall. And the blood was not just on the floor. There was also blood spattered all over the walls too. As Edmunds followed this grotesque blood trail all through the house, he passed by a spilled McDonald's coffee and a crumpled McDonald's bag and a white handbag on the floor. Then he saw a bloody handprint on the wall right beside the door to the garage, and he opened up the door. And there, lying beside her car in a big pool of blood, was Kay Parsons. Edmunds quickly rushed over and crouched down beside Kay and placed his fingers on the inside of her wrist. And amazingly, he found a pulse. Kay was alive. So Edmunds shouted for one of the deputies to call an ambulance. As Edmunds stayed crouched down with Kay, telling her over and over again that help was on the way, Edmunds just could not believe the amount of blood he was seeing, not just all over the house, but on Kay, on her face, her arms, her clothes. He had been investigating violent crime for years, but he'd never seen someone beaten as badly as Kay Parsons was. There was a bloody aluminum baseball bat lying beside Kay, and Edmunds was reasonably sure it had been used to bludgeon her. And then Edmunds also noticed there was a second weapon underneath the car, a bloody claw hammer. Seconds later, the ambulance finally arrived and Kay was rushed to the hospital. And as soon as she was gone, Edmunds led a room-by-room search of her house. And at first glance, it looked to Edmunds like Kay must have come home and interrupted a robbery in progress. The house was a complete mess upstairs and downstairs, as though someone had run through the entire house, searching every single drawer as quickly as possible. But the sheer brutality of the attack on Kay made Edmunds think this could be something else. I mean, what kind of burglar would suddenly begin bludgeoning someone to death with a hammer and bat just because they interrupted them? And so this just felt like a deeply personal crime to Edmunds, not just some random robbery. At some point during the room-by-room search, Edmunds stepped away and performed the grim duty of calling Kay's husband, David, to tell him what happened. Now, Edmunds didn't really go into any details over the phone. He just told David that he would need to fly home from Los Angeles immediately. David could tell, obviously, something terrible had happened, and by the time he hung up, David was reasonably sure that his wife had been badly injured. So he booked the first flight back to Georgia and rushed to the airport. Back at Kay's house, Edmunds knew he still had a second break-in to investigate, and he was afraid he would find another victim of a vicious attack. So Edmunds rounded up a few other deputies and walked next door to the Sears' home. The back door had been broken open, just like over at Kay's house, and the contents of drawers in the Sears' home had been dumped all over the place, just like in Kay's house. There were also smears of blood here and there, but not nearly as much as next door. The deputies combed the house from top to bottom, and luckily, they did not find another victim. Edmunds was searching the ransacked kitchen for potential evidence when Becky Sears, the mother, and her 19-year-old son, Chris, came into the backyard. Becky told Edmunds they had both been at work when her other son, Michael, had called to tell her about the break-in, so they'd rushed home as fast as they could. But Becky did not care at all about the fact that her house had been trashed and ransacked, because moments before Becky had walked into her house, a neighbor had told her that her good friend, Kay, had been taken away in an ambulance, and so all Becky wanted to know now from Edmunds was if Kay was okay. Edmunds was not really able to share any details about Kay, other than the fact that she had been alive when she was taken to the hospital. Within minutes, another neighbor appeared at the Sears' house and offered to give Becky and Chris a ride to the hospital to go check on Kay. And so Becky and Chris, they rushed out the door with that neighbor as fast as they had shown up, and Edmunds was suddenly left alone in the quiet kitchen, thinking about all these terrible things that had just unfolded in this small, seemingly safe suburban neighborhood. Edmunds figured Kay's house must have come first, and the person who broke in killed Kay, and then they must have come over to Becky's house next, but still had Kay's blood on their hands. And so that was why there was blood in both houses, despite there only being a victim in Kay's house. But that didn't make Edmunds feel much better. He now knew he was dealing with a criminal who was cool enough and cruel enough to beat this helpless woman until they were totally covered in her blood, and then casually just go next door, again covered in their blood, to rob another house. Edmunds wondered what kind of person could do something like that. Becky and some of Kay's other friends stood vigil in Kay's hospital waiting room all day long. They were desperate to get any word on Kay's condition. Every so often, Becky would ask one of the nurses if she could go in to see her friend, but they always said no, because the medical team was still trying to stabilize Kay. Eventually, another friend did make it to Kay's actual bedside, and she didn't even recognize the heavily bandaged person lying there. Kay's face was grotesquely swollen, and she was attached to all kinds of tubes and wires that were keeping her alive. The nurse wouldn't answer when the friend asked if Kay was brain dead. Finally, late in the afternoon, Kay's husband, David, arrived at the hospital straight from the airport. Sergeant Edmunds and other officers escorted David past Kay's friends to Kay's room, and they let him go in there all by himself. Seconds later, from beyond the double doors, Kay's friends heard David begin to sob. Kay had just died. Some of Kay's friends began to weep when they heard David crying, but Sergeant Edmunds had a different reaction to David. He wondered if David's loud display of grief was just a bit too much. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but Edmunds got the sense that David was just performing for an audience. While Edmunds was at the hospital, members of his investigative team had gone door to door all throughout Kay's neighborhood to try to get more information about what happened. But unfortunately, so far, they'd come up with nothing. Nobody in the neighborhood had heard or seen anything unusual between 7 and 8:30 a.m. that morning. So after Edmunds got back to the sheriff's department, he decided he would just bring in all of the people who had been at the crime scene one by one. And he started with Kay's handyman, Mitch. Once Mitch arrived at the station, Edmunds and Mitch would sit down across from each other in a small interview room. And Edmunds watched Mitch right away fight back tears as he recounted showing up at Kay's house and finding the smashed glass in the back door. Edmunds was initially skeptical of Mitch's story. After all, this guy had just happened to show up at the house right after Kay had been attacked. But Mitch would show Edmunds some emails that made it clear Kay really had been expecting him at her house at 8:30 a.m. that morning. And when Edmunds had searched Kay's house earlier, he hadn't seen any sign that Mitch ever went inside. So for the time, Edmunds decided Mitch was not a major suspect. But just when Edmunds was starting to think Mitch would have nothing useful to offer, Mitch began talking about the young man with black hair who was sitting on the other side of the street who had overheard his 911 call. The young man had told Mitch that his name was Michael and that he was Becky's oldest son. The mention of Michael made Edmunds' mind start racing. He had learned through his initial investigation that Becky's oldest son had a history of drug problems. The 22-year-old had once been a heroin addict. And Edmunds wanted to know why Michael was sitting across the street from Kay's house, which was now a murder scene, instead of in front of his own house, which had just been looted. Because remember, Michael didn't know what was going on in Kay's house until he overheard Mitch talk about Kay's house being robbed. And so Edmunds couldn't help but wonder if maybe Michael had tried to rob Kay's house to pay for his drug habit, but then Kay surprised him by coming home. She would have known Michael's face very well, and so maybe he decided to kill her so she wouldn't be able to identify him. Edmunds thanked Mitch for his help and ultimately let him go. Then he summoned Michael to the station. When Michael arrived, Edmunds led him into the small interrogation room, and the two sat down on opposite sides of a table. Michael was quiet and very polite, and as he sat there, he absently ran his hands through his dark black hair. Edmunds was very blunt, and he asked Michael if he was still using drugs. Michael admitted that he was. He said he was still fighting his heroin addiction, and in fact, that day, he had used methadone to try to curb his heroin cravings. Methadone is a medication that's often used to help people reduce or stop their use of heroin or other opiates. And so because Edmunds had wondered if Michael went to Kay's house to rob her to pay for drugs, Edmunds began to zero in on where Michael had been before the handyman Mitch had discovered the break-in at Kay's house. Michael stayed calm and polite. He claimed that his mother had dropped him off at 7 a.m. for a house painting job. But when Edmunds pressed Michael for details about this job, Michael's story fell apart. He couldn't say who he was working for or even where the job was. Now, Michael was starting to shift around in his seat uncomfortably. So Edmunds asked him again where he had been when Kay was attacked. Michael admitted he had been lying about the house painting job, but only because he didn't want his mother to know he was unemployed. He said he had really been watching TV at a friend's house. Edmunds was very annoyed that Michael had just lied to him, so he got up and walked out of the room. And Edmunds would keep Michael in that interrogation room for 3 more hours while he decided what to do with him. And in the end, Edmunds and his team, despite their suspicions, knew they really had no evidence linking Michael directly to this crime, so they couldn't just hold him indefinitely. But just before Edmunds was about to turn Michael loose, on a hunch, he asked Michael if he could look at the bottom of his sneakers. And when Michael showed him, Edmunds saw that wedged into one of the treads of one of his shoes was a gleaming shard of glass. When Edmunds asked Michael where the glass came from, Michael had no explanation. And so, as Michael walked out the door of the sheriff's office, he didn't know it, but he had just become Sergeant Edmunds' primary suspect. Not long after Michael left the sheriff's office, his 19-year-old brother, Chris, arrived for his interview. Chris was everything that Michael was not. He had a job, he had his own house, he had respectable friends, and he was so nervous when he sat down for his interview that Edmunds had to keep reassuring him that he was not actually in trouble yet. Chris said that he had gotten up that morning at about 7 a.m. He'd barely had enough time to brush his teeth before his mother, Becky, pulled up to his house. He had agreed to go work with Becky that day at the physical therapy clinic where she was the office manager. Chris was going to help out with several odd jobs around the building, but when his brother Michael had called about the break-in, Chris and his mom had left the clinic right away. Then Edmunds got Chris talking about his brother Michael, and the conversation soon turned to Michael's drug habit. Chris confirmed that his brother was taking methadone again and struggling with his heroin addiction, and he was hanging with a very bad crowd. At this, Edmunds immediately grabbed a sheet of paper and a pen, and he asked Chris to tell him the names of the people Michael was spending his time with, who in theory might commit the kind of violent crime he was investigating. Chris looked at him and he said, "You might need a larger piece of paper." By midday on March 26th, so 24 hours after Kay had been discovered, Sergeant Edmunds was totally exhausted because basically he hadn't slept for the last 24 hours. But he knew he had a killer loose in his town, so he had no choice but to press on. And the more he found out, the more he suspected Kay's neighbor, Michael. First, Edmunds talked to the friend who Michael said he was with at the time of the murder. In a recorded conversation at the sheriff's office, Michael's friend emphatically said that he and Michael really had been watching TV together when Kay was attacked. But the friend offered to take a polygraph test right then and there, and he failed. Then, later in the afternoon, Edmunds called the owner of the physical therapy clinic where Kay's friend Becky worked, and the owner told Edmunds that Becky's son, Michael, had once stolen a company checkbook and written about $800 in bad checks before he was caught. The owner said he had agreed not to call the police after Becky had promised him that her son Michael would never step foot in the clinic again. But Edmunds still wondered whether the seemingly very laid-back and low-key Michael really had it in him to commit such a totally violent crime on this woman who seemed totally defenseless. But the evidence really was increasingly against Michael. The murder was looking more and more like a robbery gone wrong, either committed by Michael or one of his friends, and very likely just to get money for drugs. That evening, Michael and Chris's mother, Becky, was leaving work at the physical therapy clinic, and as she was walking down a dark walkway towards the parking lot, she thought she heard something in the bushes behind her. Becky turned around to see what the noise was, and she was totally startled to see a man wearing black clothes with a white baseball cap standing there in the bushes. Becky froze, and the man just started shouting at her that he wanted his money. Becky said she had no idea what he was talking about, but the man clearly was not playing around because he raised a gun and started waving it right in Becky's face. But Becky really didn't know anything about any money and so kept saying, I don't know. Finally, the man seemed to have enough and he lowered the gun from Becky's face to her left leg and he fired it right into her left shin. The bullet glanced off the bone and grazed Becky's right ankle. She felt a sharp pain rushing through both her legs and she collapsed to the ground. As Becky lay there stunned and bleeding, staring up, waiting to get shot again, the man actually lowered the gun and said next time he was going to shoot her right in the face. Then the man just turned and ran off into the darkness. Becky, who was totally in shock and had no idea what was going on, still managed to grab her phone in her pocket and she called 911. After an ambulance arrived and took Becky to the hospital, sheriff's deputies searched the nearby woods for the shooter. They didn't find him, but all of them assumed one thing. This attack was not random. This shooting had to be connected to the break-ins on Hot Springs Drive and to Kay's murder. Becky was resting comfortably in her hospital bed when Sergeant Edmunds arrived to speak with her. Becky seemed perfectly fine to talk about what happened, and she would give Sergeant Edmunds a very detailed account of her attack. But when Edmunds asked her if there was any way her son Michael could have had something to do with this shooting, she was very quick to reject it. Edmunds speculated to Becky that perhaps her son Michael owed the shooter drug money, so the shooter was taking it out on Michael's mother. But Becky would respond by saying no, her son used to owe people money, but he didn't anymore. He didn't have debts anywhere. Edmunds could see this line of questioning was likely going nowhere, because Becky, despite her situation, seemed to be very set on protecting her kids, which makes sense, even if her son was guilty, she's going to protect him. So Edmunds decided to try a new tactic. He asked Becky if she had any relationship troubles. Was there anyone in her personal circle who might want to hurt her? Becky didn't answer. She turned away from Edmunds and just kind of stared off into the distance. Then, without looking at him, she told him that she had a terrible secret that she had to get off her chest. Then, Becky told Edmunds she had cheated on her husband. She said her husband was a truck driver, which meant he was away a lot, and during his absences, she had turned to another man for comfort. But she insisted the affair was over and that she and her husband were working out their issues now. Edmunds had a lot more questions, but right at that moment, nurses began coming in and out of Becky's room to check on her. So for the time being, Edmunds just kind of let the topic slide without even finding out who this other man was who Becky had been romantically involved with. The next morning, March 27th, Edmunds was hoping that his third cup of coffee might finally wake him up. His investigation was only a few days in, but Edmunds had been going nonstop. Just then, Sergeant Edmunds' phone rang, and so he picked it up, and before he could even call out a greeting, the person who was calling him said they had information about Kay's murder that he needed to hear. Edmunds asked who the caller was, but they would only say they were close to Becky and her family. Then the caller said they knew who Becky was having an affair with. It was Kay's husband, David. The caller said the neighbors, Becky and David, had been having the affair for 6 months before the murder, writing love letters back and forth and hooking up all over town. Becky wanted both of them to leave their spouses so they could be together, but David was worried that he would lose custody of his son if he split from his wife. After the anonymous caller hung up, Edmunds desperately wanted to talk to Kay's husband, David, but he knew he would have to wait until after Kay's funeral, which was that afternoon. At Kay's funeral, David was surrounded by loving supporters who had no idea that he had been cheating on his murdered wife. But one of Kay's closest friends couldn't shake the feeling that David was acting strangely for a man at his wife's funeral. When she had given David a hug, he told her that he was sorry and that he never wanted this to happen. The friend didn't understand what that meant, but she didn't think it was the right time to ask. At the end of the service, David, Becky, and all of Kay's loved ones looked on with sorrowful expressions as 6 pallbearers carried Kay's casket out of the church. Then the pallbearers put the casket into a hearse for the trip to the cemetery. David walked with his son to a waiting car that would follow the hearse, but Sergeant Edmunds approached and stopped them. Edmunds took David by the arm and quietly told him that they needed to talk right away. He said he understood that the family was obviously grieving, but really this couldn't wait. Edmunds asked David to come to the station right after Kay was interred. That evening, David looked emotionally raw and weary when he sat down across from Edmunds in the small interrogation room at the sheriff's station. Edmunds then told David point blank that he was in serious trouble and that he would not be doing his son or his family any good if he lied right now to the police and ended up going to jail. David seemed to know what this was about, and he nodded in agreement. Then Edmunds asked him about the affair with Becky, and David definitely saw this coming because right away he just began confessing. David said his affair with Becky had started about 6 months earlier when she had flirted with him on the tennis court. They had been playing doubles against Becky's husband and Kay when Becky had made a bad shot. She had leaned in close and said to David that she was playing badly because he was distracting her. Not long after that, the two began meeting at his house, her mother's house, or in their cars like it was some kind of high school romance. David said that he and Becky had pledged their love for each other, but he was just not ready to upset his own marriage. He worried that if he got divorced, Kay would take their son far away from him and prevent him from seeing him. So David and Becky's affair remained secret. But then David said he had broken things off with Becky a month before Kay's murder. David had told Becky they couldn't be together, at least until his 12-year-old son had graduated from college. David said that Becky was devastated, but she had accepted his decision and decided instead to focus on her own relationship with her husband. And Becky really had begun working on that relationship with a bracing dose of honesty. She admitted to her husband that she had been having an affair with their neighbor, David, and her husband did not take it well. He was shocked and furious, and he immediately called Kay to ask if she knew that her husband, David, was having an affair with his wife, Becky. Kay was totally caught off guard and said she absolutely did not know that. After that, David had had no choice but to confess to Kay about the affair and then beg for Kay's forgiveness. And to his surprise, Kay had accepted his apology and said they would work through their crisis together. But Kay had said she would not have her family living next door to Becky any longer. She wanted to sell the house immediately. Kay had also quit her job where she and Becky worked together, and she vowed never to speak to her former friend again. David said he was done speaking to Becky too, and that he was ready to make a fresh start. When David finished talking, Edmunds just stared at him for a second, and then looked down at his notes. Edmunds had all of David's cell phone records, and he knew that David had continued talking to Becky after their supposed breakup, including a call that lasted nearly 2 hours on the night before Kay's murder. And when Edmunds brought this up to David, that clearly David had just lied to him about his real relationship with Becky, David's face turned beet red, but he pressed ahead again. He admitted he had spoken to Becky numerous times after the breakup, but it was just to see how she was holding up. But on the night before Kay's murder, when David was in Los Angeles on business, he admitted that that long conversation he had had with Becky had turned sexual. And on that call, they had both admitted that they still had strong feelings for each other. Edmunds said that could explain the call David made the night before the murder, but David had also called Becky right around the time Kay was bludgeoned to death, so Edmunds wanted to know what that call was about. David said he had only talked to Becky on the morning of the murder because at the time he'd been worried about his wife. Kay hadn't picked up when he had called her, so kind of out of desperation, he had just called Becky to see if maybe she had heard anything about Kay. Edmunds didn't say anything back to David, but inside, he wondered if the real reason David had called right at that time was to find out if his wife had been murdered yet. David seemed to know exactly what Sergeant Edmunds was thinking, so David quickly denied having anything to do with Kay's death. He said the last thing he would ever want to do was take his son's mother away from him. Before David could say anything else, Edmunds cut him off and said, desperate people do desperate things. At this, David just kind of hunched over and fell silent. It was now dark outside, and the interview had gone on for 3.5 hours. Edmunds stood up, stretched, excused himself, and walked out of the room. Then, once he was outside the room, he watched from the other side of the one-way glass as David started to cry. And as he cried, all they could hear David saying to himself was, "Everyone is going to blame me." Edmunds knew David had been in Los Angeles at the time of Kay's murder. But after this meeting with David, he thought David could have been involved in some way. After all, David's wife was murdered, and the woman he'd been having an affair with was in the hospital from a gunshot wound. Later that evening, Edmunds was at his desk when he received a very strange call from an inmate at the county jail. The inmate said he knew who killed Kay Parsons. Edmunds asked why he should trust a guy who was in jail at the time when Kay had died, so how could he possibly know the truth? And the inmate just said Edmunds really needed to trust him because before he ended up in jail, Kay's killer had asked him to help with this murder. Edmunds was reasonably convinced that this guy had real information, but the inmate made it clear to Edmunds that he wanted to give him the information in person. So Edmunds hung up and he immediately headed to the jail. And Edmunds was waiting inside of an interview room when guards escorted in a middle-aged man dressed in pink jail sweats and flip-flops. The inmate did not hold anything back when he spoke to Edmunds, and by the time Edmunds left the county jail, he had multiple new leads to follow up on. And within days, those leads would pay off, and the police would finally figure out who had killed Kay. Based on information provided by that inmate, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Kay Parsons on the morning of March 25th, 2009. At around 7:15 a.m., the killer saw Kay's car driving down the street towards her house. So the killer quickly darted around to the back of Kay's house to those French doors. The killer had a claw hammer in their hand, and so after looking around to make sure nobody could see them, they raised that hammer and then smashed in one of the glass panes on the French doors. Then the killer reached in through the opening, unlocked the door, and stepped inside of Kay's kitchen. Now, at the same time this was happening, Kay actually was entering the home through the front door. And so the killer figured Kay must have heard the glass shattering. So the killer just kind of clutched their hammer tight and waited to see what Kay would do. A few seconds later, Kay walked into the kitchen to see what was going on, and she saw a person standing there carrying a hammer, and so naturally she began to scream. Before Kay could turn and run, though, the killer leapt at her and swung the hammer wildly. Kay immediately threw her arms up to protect her head and her face, but the killer just kept beating her arms with the hammer over and over again until she lowered them, at which point the killer began smashing Kay in the head and the torso, and blood began spraying everywhere. Kay stumbled backwards out of the kitchen, barely conscious, but somehow she managed to turn and actually run away from her killer. The killer was totally shocked that at this point Kay was still on her feet, and so for a second the killer just stood there watching as Kay kind of stumbled down the hallway. But when Kay actually reached the door that led into the garage, the killer kind of realized what they needed to do, and they chased after Kay. And so Kay, she gets that door open, and she manages to walk into the garage, but by this point she had lost so much blood, she was so badly beaten that she just fell to the ground right by her parked car. The killer rushed into the garage after her, and then stood over Kay and raised the hammer, but the hammer was so slick from all the blood on it that when they tried to bring it down, it slipped out of their hand and slid under Kay's car. In a panic, the killer looked around the garage for another weapon to finish Kay off, and their eyes fell on the aluminum bat propped up against the wall. The killer lunged for the bat and then came back over to Kay, and they stood there bludgeoning her over and over and over again until she wasn't moving. The killer, the garage, and Kay were now all covered in blood, and the killer was reasonably sure that at this point Kay was dead. They had no idea she actually still had a pulse. The killer dropped the bat and ran back into the house. They trashed every room inside, throwing things on the ground and doing whatever they could to make it look like this was a robbery. Then, feeling satisfied, the killer crept out through the open French door, stepping on broken glass as they left. Once they were outside, the killer glanced back and forth to make sure nobody had seen them. Then they ran right next door into Becky's house and ransacked that place too. But then, after they were done, instead of leaving, the killer stripped off their bloody clothes and found a fresh set of clothes in that house to change into, and then they grabbed their phone and called their mother. It would turn out Becky's heroin addict son, Michael, who everybody assumed was involved in some way with this murder, had nothing to do with it. Becky's other son, Chris, the so-called good son, he had been the one who murdered Kay. Chris had always been Becky's favorite child, and he would do anything to make his mom happy. Becky had told Chris things about her life that she would never tell her other son, Michael. So Chris was aware of the fact that his mom was having an affair with their neighbor, David, and that she believed David was actually still in love with her. And so Chris also came to believe that his neighbor, Kay, was actually standing in the way of his mother's happiness. In fact, Becky had even said to Chris that she wanted Kay dead. And all of this information began to come to light when Sergeant Edmunds met with the inmate who had called him. It turned out the inmate was Becky's own brother, and he told Sergeant Edmunds that Becky had asked him if he knew anyone who could kill Kay and make it look like an accident. At first he had thought she was joking, but after Becky kept pressing him, he knew she was serious. So when he learned that Kay really had been killed, he was sure his sister had something to do with it. And so that's why he reached out to Sergeant Edmunds. Now, after hearing this from the inmate, Edmunds still believed that Michael had to be involved, that maybe Becky had asked him to carry out the murder. But when Edmunds questioned Michael again, it was clear the young man had no idea about his mother's affair. So Edmunds went back to the hospital to meet with Becky, who was still recovering from her gunshot wounds. Edmunds interrogated Becky, and she finally cracked. She admitted that she had told her other son Chris all about the affair and about how much she hated Kay, But Becky didn't stop there. She told Edmunds that she had asked Chris to confront Kay on her behalf on the morning of the murder, but she said she didn't think her son would do anything violent. But after Chris had just killed Kay and then came back to his own house and staged another break-in and changed out of his bloody clothes, he had called his mother and told her he had just murdered Kay. She had driven to the house, picked Chris up, and gone with him to dispose of his bloody clothes. And then when they came back to the house, because her other son Michael had called her saying, "Oh my goodness, our house has been broken into," when she and Chris came back, all the police were there, and she would tell the police right away that she and Chris had been working at the clinic all that morning. And then after that, Becky and Chris had staged the shooting outside of Becky's work. Chris was the shooter who had leapt out of the bushes. Becky hoped this shooting would remove suspicion from her and her family and allow Chris to get away with Kay's murder. Even after admitting all of that, Becky still insisted that she had nothing to do with Kay's death. She told Edmunds that she had just totally messed up when she had given her son, Chris, the impression that she really wanted him to go do something horrible to Kay. But police and prosecutors did not believe that Becky was as innocent as she let on, and so both she and her son Chris were arrested. In the end, Becky and Chris pleaded guilty to the murder of Kay Parsons in order to avoid the death penalty. Both are now serving life sentences without the possibility of parole.
In 2018, James and Brittany Campbell jetted off to the very famous Little Vegas Chapel, which is located just off the Las Vegas, Nevada Strip, and they got married by a man dressed up as Elvis Presley while the couple stood in front of a pink Cadillac. While their wedding was certainly not traditional by Western standards, it somehow seemed fitting for the newlyweds. After all, they were not a traditional couple. Brittany, who was 36 years old, was extremely energetic and outgoing and bubbly, and she even referred to herself as being a little crazy. As for James, who was 35 years old, he was reserved and quiet and kind of analytical and would rarely act on impulse. And on top of these two just being complete and total polar opposites, they had actually dated previously back in high school, and it had not worked out. They had broken up and gone their separate ways, not expecting to see each other again. But nearly 2 decades later, they randomly reconnected, and this time they had something major in common. James was a single father of 2 young boys, and he was desperately looking for a partner to not only share his life with, but someone who would come in and help him raise his kids. As for Brittany, she too was single, and she really wanted to be a mother. And so the timing of their reunion was perfect. A year after the wedding, James, who was serving in the U.S. Navy, was given orders to spend a couple of years working out of a naval base in Hawaii. So the family of 4, along with their little cat named Mr. Franklin, packed up all of their things and left the mainland of the United States, and they landed in Honolulu, which is the capital of Hawaii. The family would move into a modest 2-story home located just a couple of minutes' drive away from the airport. The house was located at the end of a cul-de-sac in this very quiet and safe neighborhood that really didn't look like the type of neighborhood you would expect to see on a beautiful Hawaiian island. It really just kind of looked like typical American suburbs, with all these cookie-cutter 2-story houses right up next to each other on either sides of the road, and out front everyone's got a white picket fence. But for the Campbells, who had never lived in Hawaii before and were used to living on mainland America, it was actually kind of nice to move into this neighborhood and have it look kind of familiar. And so before long, the Campbell family loved their new Hawaii house. That is, until they learned their house had a dark secret. It all started in June of 2019, so not long after the Campbells had moved to Hawaii. Brittany, she had to go into the garage to get something. Now, their garage was attached on the left side of their house if you were looking at their house from the street, and there was a door on the first floor of the house that led into the garage. And so Brittany, she walked across the first floor, she opened that door in the house, she went into the garage, she flipped on the light switch, and what she saw all over the garage made no sense to her. They still had a bunch of moving boxes that they had not unpacked since they'd only been in Hawaii for a matter of weeks. And so all these unopened boxes, they had just kind of stacked up inside of the garage. But when Brittany had turned the lights on and looked into the garage, she saw nearly all of those boxes had been toppled over, and lots of the contents inside of these boxes had spilled out onto the ground. But even more bizarrely, it looked like it wasn't totally haphazard. it looked like someone had intentionally kind of sifted through the boxes and taken out random objects and put them into strange piles that didn't make any sense. The objects were not alike. Or they had taken the objects and kind of stood them up in these strange arrangements, almost like they were being laid out for a garage sale. And so Brittany immediately just turns around and she leaves the garage. She goes to the other side of the house and she gets her husband. She brings James back and he looks inside. He's just as shocked as she is. And the two of them immediately just go into the garage and begin looking through all of the stuff to see if anything is missing. Now, it was pretty difficult to tell if something had been stolen, but they did have some valuable stuff that was in those boxes that had been pulled out and was lying on the ground, and that wasn't missing. And so that was a pretty good indication to James and Brittany that this wasn't a robbery. And so the only other thing they could think of would be that their two young sons must have come in here and been goofing around and pulled the boxes over, and so this is their doing. But when the parents confronted the two young sons, they said they didn't do it. Brittany believed them, but James didn't necessarily. He thought they could be lying about it, and if they were telling the truth, then, maybe one of their pets had gotten into the garage and caused all this chaos. They had purchased a dog when they got to Hawaii, so they had a cat and a dog. And so James was just being very dismissive of this whole garage incident and not taking seriously the fact that Brittany was really spooked by this. But regardless of how the family members felt about the garage incident, they all just kind of moved on because there really wasn't anything to do except pick the garage up and continue on. About a week after the garage incident, Brittany was home alone one morning getting ready. She was sitting in the master bedroom in front of her mirror and she was applying eyeliner and she had a YouTube video playing some makeup tutorials. And as she's applying the makeup, she suddenly hears the front door downstairs slam shut. She almost pokes her eye out with her eyeliner. She's so startled by the sound of it. And she immediately pauses her YouTube video and she calls out for James and her sons, believing they must be home and somebody slammed the door. But when she calls out, she gets no response. Now, immediately, Brittany is going through all of these different rationalizations like, okay, maybe James and the boys opened the door, they got something or put something in the house, they slammed it and they left. And so that's why they didn't hear me call their name. But she couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. She's also thinking about the garage incident, which really never left her. She pretended like she had moved on, but really she hadn't. And so she stands up and she begins walking towards the open door that led out into the hallway. And then from the master bedroom, if you were looking out into the second floor hallway, it basically went straight across to another door. That was her son's bedroom. And in between these two doors, basically halfway down the second floor hallway, to the left was a flight of stairs that went straight down to the first floor. And when you reached the bottom of those steps, right in front of you would be the front door, the door that had slammed. And so Brittany reaches the threshold of the master bedroom. She's looking out into the second floor hallway. She doesn't see anyone. And so she yells out again for James and for her sons. But again, there's silence. So she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the second floor hallway and she makes it halfway. She turns left and she gets onto the stairs. And as she's walking down these steps, the house is eerily quiet and she's got this growing sense of dread inside of her. And she's kind of quietly calling out for James and her sons, but it's totally quiet. And she gets to the foot of the stairs. She kind of scans around her. She doesn't see anyone. And then she walks to the front door. She flings it open, expecting, hoping to see James's car in the driveway or just see some indication that her husband or her sons had been there or were there. But when she opened that door, James's car was not there. There was no sign of anybody in the area. It was just her. And so with her heart racing, she shut the door, she locked it, and then she walked all around the first floor, checking every window, checking every door, making sure everything was locked. She went upstairs, she did the same thing, checking every room, every closet. There was no one in the house with her, she was sure of it. And so she went back to her room, thinking to herself, what do I make of that? How do I reconcile the fact that I clearly heard the front door slam, but no one's here? And so Brittany would eventually leave the house and go about her day. And then that evening, she would come back home and her husband and her sons would be there. And at some point, she would bring up the slamming door to her husband to get a sense of, could that have been him? And he would tell her that no, he had not come by the house that day, so that could not have been him. But he assured his wife, don't worry, you probably just unlocked the door and a draft came through and slammed the door. You got nothing to worry about. But Brittany would tell her husband that that was just not possible, that she always shut the door. She always shut and locked the door. So the idea that she had forgotten to lock it and had left it partially ajar enough to the point that a draft could slam it the way it did, it just didn't make any sense. But just like the garage incident, James was very dismissive and just told his wife, "You're being super paranoid. You have nothing to worry about. It's just a door. Don't worry about it." But this really upset Brittany, and she got mad at James, and before long, the two were just totally fighting about it. And by the time they actually laid their heads down on their pillows that night, they weren't even speaking. And so the couple that night, they fall asleep angrily, and then in the middle of the night, Brittany wakes up suddenly. She doesn't know why she's woken up, but she's kind of looking around the room. It's totally silent, and she's trying to get her bearings. And as she's sitting there, she hears downstairs, not a slamming door, but the sound of a door opening and then shutting. Immediately, she is on heightened alert. And instead of doing anything, she just kind of leans forward and listens really intently to make sure she really heard what she thought she just heard. And as she's sitting there listening, she can hear again another door downstairs, a different door, opening and then shutting. And at this point, she begins to panic. She reaches over, she shakes James awake, and she tells him, "I can hear someone opening and shutting doors downstairs." Now, James was not remotely thrilled to be having this conversation. He was still mad at his wife for being so paranoid about the door earlier, and so to be woken up in the middle of the night to his wife freaking out about more doors being open and shut, he was just really upset. And so he sits up, he's totally annoyed, and he's not ready to really take seriously anything Brittany is saying, and Brittany's picking up on this, and so finally she just says, "James, did you lock the front door before you went to bed?" And so James is like, "Yes, I locked the front door. I'm telling you, you're hearing things. There's nothing going on in this house." But Brittany was not convinced, and she says, "You know what? You can think nothing's going on, but I'm going downstairs to make sure no one is in this house." And so Brittany would get out of her bed, she'd walk over to the open door that led into the second floor hallway, and as soon as she looked out, she didn't see anything, she didn't hear anything, and so very slowly she began walking down the second floor hallway until she reached the top of the stairs. And at that point, she turned and looked downstairs into the pitch black first floor. She was terrified, but she knew she had to go down there to make sure her family was safe. And so down the stairs she went, and when she got to the bottom of the stairs, she saw right away the front door was unlocked. Brittany's thinking, why would my husband tell me he locked the door if it's not locked? And so then Brittany's thinking, okay, my sons must have gotten out of bed and they must have unlocked the door. That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing these doors opening and shutting because my sons are down here somewhere and they're the ones causing all this noise. And so Brittany kind of felt relieved for a second because this seemed like what must be going on. But after locking the front door and then searching the whole first floor, she didn't find her sons. And then when she went upstairs again and went into her boys' room, she found both of them were fast asleep in their beds. And when she shook them awake, they showed no sign of having been awake recently. They were totally groggy and could not have been running around the house just minutes earlier. And so now Brittany is terrified. She tucks her boys back in and she tells them, everything's fine. But then she hustles back over to the master bedroom with her husband and she tells James, the front door was unlocked and our sons were fast asleep. It couldn't have been them. But James continues to be very dismissive, telling his wife, you are totally overreacting. You're being paranoid. You're just hearing the sound of those doors because you're scared. There isn't any doors slamming in the house. And as he's saying this, their back sliding door downstairs that led to their backyard suddenly slammed open and then slammed shut. And as soon as this happened, James, who had been so dismissive and totally skeptical, he instantly changed. And he looked at his wife and he said, you stay right here. And he jumped out of his bed and he ran out of the bedroom. A few minutes later, he would come back into the master bedroom and he would tell his wife that, the back door, it was unlocked, but it was shut. I'm sure you just forgot to lock it. And the same draft that is opening and shutting doors, probably opened and shut the back door too. So we got nothing to worry about. The house is locked right now. Let's just get in bed and go to sleep. And at this, Brittany is incredulous. And she says to her husband, you gotta be kidding me. There is something weird happening in our house. Doors are opening and shutting. We had that thing with the garage. You can't act like nothing is happening. And this, in turn, turned into a big fight. And so before long, the parents weren't even talking about who opened and shut the doors downstairs. They were just fighting with each other. And then eventually, they were just so tired that they gave up and they both went to sleep. For the next few weeks, nothing happened inside of the house. Brittany, though, continued to obsess over who or what had been causing those doors to open and shut, and then also, what happened in the garage, what caused all that stuff to fall out and wind up in these strange arrangements. Meanwhile, James continued to be unbelievably dismissive and did not want to talk about the potential for something strange happening in their house. But something strange would happen to just James without Brittany around, and that would be the first time that he would get really spooked. It was a couple of weeks after the nighttime door slamming incident, and James, he was alone at his house. It's the middle of the day, and he decided he would just play the piano. And so he moved to his piano in the living room, which is on the first floor. He sat down and he began playing. And then after a little while, he started to feel like he was being watched. And it got to the point where it was so uncomfortable, he had to stop playing and actually look around and make sure he really was alone. And when he did that, he noticed out the window to his right, which led into the side yard, that there was clearly a figure standing in the window outside looking in with its arms down. But there was a curtain over the window, and so all he could see was this shadow figure standing at the window. And so James is immediately startled, and as soon as he reacted to this figure, the figure suddenly starts moving towards the back of the house. And so James, he gets up and he rushes over to another window that looked into the backyard, and he looks outside, and there's no one there. And then he goes back to the window he originally saw the figure in, he opens it up, there's no one there. And so James would ultimately tell himself that, okay, that must have just been some nosy neighbor that heard the music, they came over, and they noticed that maybe I saw them and they ran off before I could see them. And so that's what it was. But deep down, what he saw in the window really shook him up. However, it would be the blanket incident that would finally push James to go from being dismissive and skeptical to admitting to his wife, we got a problem. It was not long after James spotted that dark figure outside of the window when he and his wife and his 2 kids decided they would head out to a movie theater to catch a movie. And so as they're getting ready to go, Brittany would say that she wanted to bring along a particular blanket that the whole family loved to use when they were sitting on the couch. She was going to bring that blanket with her to the movie theater to kind of cuddle up under for the movie. And so she would make her way into the living room and she would see the blanket was missing. It was not on the couch where it normally was. And so she would ask her husband and her sons if they had any idea where it was, and they would say, no, we haven't touched it. She would look all over the place, under the couch, in the living room. She went upstairs. She couldn't find it. And so finally they just left without the blanket. But when they came back that evening, there on the couch, folded up neatly, was this blanket. Everybody knew that blanket had not been there when they left. So how did it get there? For the next few weeks, the parents did their best to put on a brave face and tell their kids that everything was okay. But the parents and the kids were all terrified to be in that house. And that's because at night, the doors continued to open and shut. Their dog periodically would just start barking in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. And they would all get this awful sense that they were being watched all the time in their house. And so finally, by September of that year, the parents decided, we just have to get out of this house. We cannot be here. We need to take a break. And so they packed up their stuff and they flew to mainland America, where they stayed with some family for a week. On September 20th, they hopped back on a plane and they flew back to Honolulu. And as they're driving from the airport to their house, Brittany and James were just kind of secretly hoping that, whatever weirdness was happening in their house would just magically stop once they returned. But as soon as James turned onto their street and they could see their house, they knew that was not going to be the case. Because as they began driving up their road, they could see James's very nice road bike was laying on their driveway. And so Brittany, she turned to her husband, and even though she knew the answer, she said, James, were you riding your bike before we left? And James, who doesn't even look at his wife, just shakes his head. No, he wasn't. And so James drives all the way down the road. He turns into their driveway, which is lined up right with the front of the garage door. And after James parks the car, he hits the garage door opener button. And so as James is sitting in the driver's seat, Brittany's right next to him, the kids are in back. They're watching as this door is raising right in front of them. And as soon as they can see into the garage, they see everything in their garage has just been completely trashed. Things are not just dumped out, but things have been ripped apart and shredded as if a wild animal had been let loose inside of the garage. James immediately said to his wife, "We've been robbed." And then he hopped out of the car and then turned and told his kids, "You stay in the car, do not get out." And James, he went over to the side of the house and got a sledgehammer for protection and made his way to the front door. Meanwhile, Brittany would be on the phone with 911 to report that someone had broken into their house. A few minutes later, James was inside of his house, and he saw the entirety of his house was just like the garage. It had been completely ripped to shreds. But amidst the chaos were those kind of strange piles of random objects, much like they had seen in that first garage incident where the things inside of the boxes had been stacked in kind of strange piles and arrangements. And so James is looking around his first floor and he's seeing stacks of coasters and books and electronics. But what really got James's attention was that on various surfaces, there were these medical vials of drugs or chemicals that were placed all over the place. And he knew that was not his family's. Someone had brought those vials into this house. James would make his way up the stairs to the second floor landing, and right away he could tell, the upstairs had all the hallmarks of being destroyed as much as the first floor. But when he went left and went into his boys' room, he saw that room was pristine. In fact, it had been cleaned. The boys' laundry was neatly folded on one side of the room, their beds were perfectly made with military precision, and all of their toys and different things that were normally all over the floor were neatly put away in the places they should go. And so James would turn around and leave his boys' room in absolute astonishment, and he would walk across the second floor hallway into the master bedroom. And what he would find in there would make an already terrible situation much, much worse. The master bedroom was destroyed like the majority of the house and garage, except the top of their bed was not covered in junk. Instead, on their bed was this towel that had been neatly laid out, almost like a tablecloth. And laying on this towel, neatly spaced apart, kind of perfectly arranged, were a bunch of knives. And then next to the knives, still on the towel, was a laptop that the Campbell family owned, but they didn't use it. It did work, but it just kind of sat in the master bedroom. And this laptop was sitting on this towel, and it was open, but the screen had turned off. And so by this point, Brittany had come upstairs. And so Brittany and James, they walk over in horror to this layout on their bed, and they click the keys on the keyboard of their laptop, and it illuminates the screen and shows whatever was being worked on last. And it's this long, long Word document that neither of them made. They scrolled to the top of this document, and the document was titled The Omnivore Trials, and then below that it said, A Rehabilitation for Rat-like People. And then below that, the entire document was kind of like a diary. It was a whole bunch of observations about so-called specimens, and these specimens were very clearly the Campbell family. And these observations made about the Campbell family were very intimate. In fact, the only way to garner these observations were if you were watching the Campbell family right up close, almost on an hourly basis for days, weeks, months at a time. These observations ranged from what time the Campbell family liked to watch TV to what James and Brittany talked about behind closed doors in their bedroom, including their struggle to have a child, something they were not talking about to their family. But in this document, the author of the Omnivore Trials would talk about how the creature, which was referencing Brittany, needed to stop trying to have another baby and instead focus on the children she already had. Toward the end of this really lengthy document, the author of the Omnivore Trials came to a shocking conclusion that in order to rehabilitate these rat-like people, the Campbells, the author would have to perform several surgeries on the specimens. These surgeries were hand amputations and gender reassignment surgeries. And then after this conclusion, there was another note that detailed all the different surgeon tools the author would need to perform these surgeries, as well as a list of drugs and chemicals they would need in order to sedate these specimens before they performed these surgeries. And so after James and Brittany see this, they realize that those knives laying out on the towel were for them. Those were the knives that were going to be used for the surgeries. And all those weird vials, those medical vials they saw all downstairs, those were likely the drugs that would be used to sedate them so they could go under the knife. 15 minutes before James and Brittany went into their house and discovered the knives, the medical vials, and the laptop, James grabbed that sledgehammer and walked to the front door while his wife called 911. And so James, he gets to the front door, he puts his key into the lock, he unlocks it, and with the sledgehammer in one hand, he attempts to push the door open. But despite the door being unlocked, he can't open it. There's resistance behind the door. And so James kind of gets down and he presses as hard as he can into the door with his shoulder until finally it opens up just a crack and James can see into the house. And so James, as he's pressing the door barely open, he's staring into this crack, trying to make out what's going on inside of his house. And then suddenly a set of eyes meet his from behind the door. And before James can do anything, this man that is standing inside of his house says to James,
"This is not your house,"
and then proceeds to push the door shut on James. James, in an adrenaline-fueled fury, smashed the door open, grabbed this guy, and yanked him out of the house and threw him onto the front yard. And then James, with his sledgehammer, would stand in front of this guy between him and his kids and his wife, and he would say, "If you go anywhere, I'm going to have to attack you with this." But the intruder, this guy, whose name was Ezekiel Zayas, he was a 23-year-old young man, he would just stand on the Campbell's property, staring directly at James, unblinking. And then, a couple of minutes later, the police would show up, and Ezekiel would not put up any fight, he would be arrested, and he would be taken away. It was after he was gone that James and his wife would actually go into their house, and they would see the state it was in, and they would go upstairs, and they would discover the knives and the laptop. It would turn out, months earlier, Ezekiel had apparently found a way to sneak in and out of the Campbell's property. And so around the time they had moved in, Ezekiel was living there as well. He was mostly living in the crawl space above the second floor bathroom, and then whenever he was able to, Ezekiel would climb down out of this crawl space, and he would go and observe the Campbells. And this was not just at night. Based on some of the observations inside of Ezekiel's Omnivore Trials document, clearly he was watching the family in the middle of the day too. Also, based on these observations in this document, it was pretty clear that Ezekiel was getting ready to actually carry out these surgeries on the Campbell family, meaning the Campbells' decision to go on vacation when they did could very well have saved their lives. And if there was any question as to whether Ezekiel could have actually carried out that level of physical harm on another human being by carrying out those surgeries, well, after he was arrested for what he did to the Campbells, while he was in jail, he beat his cellmate to death, allegedly. Although a guard literally walked in and saw Ezekiel punching and kicking and beating this guy, and then he died. But technically the trial is not over, so it's allegedly. Ezekiel is currently in a state hospital, and they are trying to determine if he is fit to stand trial for what he did to the Campbells and for what he did to his cellmate. Even though it might be self-explanatory at this point in the video, it's worth pointing out that we have no idea what Ezekiel's motives were for why he did the things he did to the Campbell family or what he was looking to achieve with the so-called Omnivore Trials. We also don't know why he allegedly killed his cellmate. As for the Campbells, this whole experience was so traumatic